Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eden, Director of Programming at Mana Contemporary. And we're so excited to welcome you this evening to our program, Actors from Witnesses. This panel is hosted by Mana Contemporary and presented in partnership with the Earth Institute at Columbia University and the Columbia Climate School. We're joined by artists Zaria Foreman and Jeff Ross, whose works will be included in our upcoming exhibition, Implied Scale. The exhibition not only aims to convey the magnitude of the Earth's climate crisis, but it also aims to inspire action. The exhibition is on view from April 22nd to July 22nd. So stay tuned and register to visit us through a tour. For today's panel, we're joined by Robin Bell, professor at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and president of the American Geophysical Union, who will moderate the conversation with artists Zaria Foreman and Jeff Ross and Caroline Drong, atmospheric science and modern future climate PhD candidate at Columbia University. Robin, Zaria, Jeff, and Caroline, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Eden, for having us. It's so lovely to be here. I love talking about science, but I also love talking about art and science and how we can walk across that bridge between these two creative spaces and how we can use both science and art to make our world a better place and make it a place that's everybody can thrive and have a sustainable life and an equitable future. And I see that, that's what science and art together can do. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start by having introductions from each of our artists and artist scientists. And then we're going to have a conversation about how we see the role of science and art together in this space of moving from just being actors or witnesses to actually being warriors and agents of change. So with this, I'm going to turn it over to Zaria Foreman to give the first of our introduction. I'm going to let them introduce themselves because I think that's the most fun.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Mana Contemporary for having us. It's an honor to be here. I am in very sunny California, which is why there's bright light shining across my face. So I have basically been an artist my whole life. But for the past 15 years or so, my work has focused on conveying the urgency of climate change. And I'll just point out for a moment, these are drawings. They're pastel drawings, not photographs. They're very often confused for photographs, especially when you're looking at them on a computer screen. So just so you know, all these images that you'll be seeing are soft pastel on paper drawings. I've been focusing on climate for the past 15 years. And in order to do that, I've traveled to places where the ice is melting and also where the sea levels are rising. And I actually spent a lot of my childhood growing up visiting really remote, far away landscapes, undeveloped places especially. And those experiences really, I think, instilled in me just a deep love of landscape. And, when you love something, you want to protect it, right? So my work has always been about offering you a chance to experience a place that you might not have the chance to actually visit in person. And by showing you the beauty of these places, I hope to inspire you to want to help protect and preserve them. So, what else can I tell you? The piece that I have hanging in the Mana Contemporary exhibition is from a somewhat recent body of work that involved NASA inviting me to fly with them over Antarctica. This happened about 5 years ago now, I think. I got an email in my inbox from NASA inviting me to Antarctica, and I was like, this is definitely a prank. But sure enough, a few months later, I found myself meeting the science team of Operation Icebridge, which has been mapping the ice at both poles for over a decade now. They do these flight paths over the ice, just flying about 1,500 feet in the air, which is not that high when you think about it. And I had the opportunity to fly with them over both poles, and to see the ice from a whole different perspective than what I had been used to before. And that opportunity really allowed me to just have a proximity with the scientists, first of all. And I was able to ask them, this is another piece from that body of work, by the way, ask them just a bazillion questions about the ice, how they were measuring it, what we were looking at. This piece right here is inspired by an image that I took out the window of the cockpit, which is where most of my inspiration came from, because it was just the best windows. And it's actually of a glacier, the Jakobshavn Glacier, which is the more modern version. I need to memorize the Inuit name. That's what its title is now, but I don't know it by heart. But this is actually the first glacier that I ever saw with my family in 2007 when I visited Greenland for the very first time. And so this was 10 years later, after that very first trip, I got to fly above the glacier and see it from this whole different perspective. And then to rewind time 5 years after my first trip there, I ended up spreading my mother's ashes. She had just passed away, and I spread her ashes in that bay where the glacier dumps its icebergs. So it was cool for me to be able to revisit that landscape and remember the time that I had with my mother there, and then to be able to revisit her now as she's a part of that landscape, even as it too passes and takes on these new forms. Yeah, so I guess I'll just, is that enough, or should I keep talking? There's more images. I can keep talking. You can keep going if you want me to keep talking.
That was the end. I mean, it's up to you. Happy to move on to Jeff if we're ready.
Oh, that's the end. Okay.
Jeff, your turn.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jeff, and I do a lot of video art and photography. I traffic in quite a few different mediums, but I think it makes the most sense to say that my main mediums are time and sound. And so that can manifest in a lot of different ways, as like these time-lapse photography films that I create, and sound because I'm a failed musician, and it reinvented itself into making films and doing sound design for them. So I grew up in a southeastern corner of Utah, hiking and camping with my grandfather and doing Boy Scouts and working on my dad's farm. We farmed wheat. And so I've always been like very connected with the land, just always, in the dirt, and, camping in the dirt and like camping out in the open and doing things like that. And I guess that, I was doing, painting abandoned houses, these large scale optical illusions in abandoned houses, and like this one right here. And I, by accident, caught a wildfire on the way to the Salton Sea by the wind farms by Palm Springs. And I was absolutely fascinated by that. And I ditched all my other plans, and I just, time lapsed it from the side of the road as long as I could. And it blew my camera over, and I almost destroyed it. And it was the whole thing. But that was 2012 was the first time I shot a wildfire. And so once I finished the project that I was working on, I started pursuing shooting fires as an artist. And I went and trained as a firefighter, so I understood fire weather. And this is a picture of me shooting for National Geographic last year. But I go to fires more as an artist than a journalist, and it's not documentation. And so what I wound up creating was this monster of a project that kind of took on a life of its own. I went to 70 wildfires over the course of about 5 years, and went all the way in. This is actually me on the movie poster here. I'm standing back to check my camera, and I accidentally got a pretty good selfie there. So, I just wanted to, the impetus for doing that initially was I wanted to show a present day effect of climate change. But as the progress progressed and became more and more of a monster, more and more effort than I ever thought it would be, I kind of felt like, what? Climate change is super obvious. And I see all these people going through all these things. I see the earth itself going through this trauma. And well, or at least the living beings on it. And that includes plants and trees. And I found myself at this place where whenever I closed my eyes, I would see everything burned to the ground or burning. And so I shifted and I started doing transcendental meditation. And I based the structure of the film on the 5 stages of grief. So there's 5 chapters. It took me 5 years and 30 terabytes of information to make a 25-minute film. And so it's like chapter 1's denial, and then, you know, anger, bargaining, sadness, acceptance. And that is not, I don't think there's anything out there quite like it. And it's a big reason why I'm talking to you today. And I think that the curator of this Mana show saw both Zarya and I on the same PBS news segment. And so I'm just really grateful to be here. And I'm really wanting to, I've been rethinking how I approach climate communication in the last several years as I read more studies and read more things about communication and emotional intelligence and indigenous knowledge. And I'm just hoping to, you know, I think that what we're doing here in a lot of ways is having a conversation with the choir. And so I'm like, my mentality is, all right, let's have a conversation with the choir, because there's other preachers within that. And you know, just talk about how we're talking about these issues. And I'm just happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jeff. That was fascinating. Carolyn.
Yes, thank you so much. So, unlike our 2 brilliant artists here, I have more of a standard scientific presentation. But so I first just want to give a shout out to the audience members. I see several familiar names, and just in general to everybody, thank you for being here. So I'm Caroline Drong. I'm a 2nd-year PhD student at Columbia University in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And I'm really excited to be brought onto this conversation today with artists and scientists, because that's really what my life career has been about so far. It's been art and science. And so I'm going to briefly just talk a little bit about my background. So if you can go to the next slide, I've been really grateful and really fortunate that I've gotten a chance to speak about my science on major conference like platforms, where in this picture in the center is at the last International Astronautical Congress when it was back in person pre-pandemic. And surrounding it are the various different art pieces that I've done just for my own personal work and also for different organizations that I'm affiliated with. And it's really just about being able to express my science and my art in ways that are both orally and also visually that convey my passions for different things and for the things I'm excited about, which are science and accessibility and STEM communication. So if you go to the next slide, a little bit about my art side is that I really like this idea of imagining inspirational futures. So being able to connect art with this idea of accessibility, whether on space or on Earth. So this particular piece that I did recently was a digital artwork of a bunch of civilian astronauts looking out to the Earth rise, so seeing the Earth rise over the moon, and being able to experience that together in this more casual conversational fashion than, say, like the Apollo missions, where it was more military driven and it was about trying to race other countries. And that's like one particular way. And then if you go to the next slide, I'm also just really excited to be able to translate this art form into ways to convey my science. So this particular piece was a piece from 2016. It was a 4-page comic or sequential art of the father of modern geology, who talks about how the Earth is more than 6,000 years old, and we can tell that by this constant destruction and reforming of rocks in the rock cycle, and relating that to plate tectonics and volcanoes. And so really being a part of this conversation today to me is connecting these ideas of combining science and art, bridging those, and then bridging it again in order to talk about this issue of climate change. So on the next slide, which is my final slide, so I've been working as a PhD student to investigate the increasing wildfires in California and in the Western United States in general. So this graph here is a graph of data from a database I've been compiling from government sources and satellite-based data from 1984 to 2020. And on the y-axis is the forest burned area. So this is like just focusing on forests in the Western United States and the area burned. So just like, think about just like kilometers squared or acres, that kind of unit of burned area. And it's a linear trend upwards since 1984. And we can see that climate change has a big part to do with it. And on the yellow dot there, and what you've seen with Jeff's photos is just the magnitude of wildfires in California that's been going on this past season. So this is just my primer for talking about climate change and talking about how art and climate and science can all relate together. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And you know, how wonderful to have a snapshot of each of yours passion of, you know, fire, ice, science, art, all rolled up into one. I love hearing your stories and your journeys. Just fascinating that, you know, how the landscapes, you know, whether it's Caroline being so dreaming of the landscape, looking back at our planet, to Zarya growing up, traveling and looking at remote things, to, I liked Jeff telling us how he grew up digging in the dirt on in the wheat farm with his family. So I'm wondering, you know, how did each of you come to understand the planet was changing? And, you know, how did it strike you? I mean, I can still remember, it's one of those visceral moments in my life where I remember probably somebody Zarya ran into on Icebridge. I was talking with a geeky scientist, because that's what scientists do, coming up with a plan. And I was in an airport because, you know, we used to travel a lot. And I was waiting for my bag to come out, talking on the phone, waiting for my bag to come out. And he's telling me that Greenland's changing. It's like, okay, fine. But that's not what I remember. What I remember is hearing the fear in my colleague's voice. And that was just, I will always remember that moment of him saying, it's changing faster than we thought, and watching the carousel, watching the bags go around on the carousel. So, and I've had a journey since then to go from that, oh my God, to we have to do something. Oh, you know, well, how about each of you? You know, Zarya, since you went first, why don't we start with you again? You know, how did you come to understand the scientific evidence that the planet's changing, and what was, or it could have not been scientific evidence, it could have been a landscape.
Yeah. So I remember it very vividly, as you do. My very first trip to Greenland, which I mentioned before, in 2007 with my family, and I had just graduated from college a couple years prior, and it was my first time visiting, like seeing a glacier, seeing icebergs, going to a polar region. And the place where we were staying, there were a lot of scientists that were there to study the ice. They were flying up onto the ice cap and doing studies there. And basically anyone who was visiting, you know, this small place where we were staying, there weren't a lot of tourists. It was mostly, you know, government officials, newscasters, these scientists. And so it was really in conversation with them. They were having these meetings, and then they would discuss them with us. You know, we would just have conversation at a dinner or walking out into the landscape. And it was shocking what they were telling us. And I knew of this sort of like distant concept of climate change. I'd heard of climate change, or global warming probably is what it was at that point. But I didn't really understand. I didn't really know what it was. It was just like, oh, this thing, you know, that we should maybe worry about, but what, you know, don't really know much about that. So it was really the first time I started to learn more deeply about the crisis, and learn that it really was probably arguably the largest global crisis that we face as a global society. And at the same time, I was really I was using that trip to make work. I was already making drawings about landscape, but my artist statements were more about the powerful forces of nature and how that can help put things in perspective in our personal lives, and a bit more of a broad, inspiration. And I was looking for something a little bit more meaningful to imbue in my work, something that was more than just a pretty picture for somebody's wall, but to address something that had meaning. And so it was kind of this, I feel like perfect storm is the wrong is the wrong term for this moment, but I was really shocked by what I was hearing from the scientists, and it became very clear to me. I was already planning on making work about that place, about Greenland. And so it really clicked for me, where I was like, oh, this is what I need to focus on. This is clearly one of the largest crises we face as a global society. And there wasn't a question in my mind, like, this is what I need to focus on with my work. And that has been, it hasn't changed. And that was 2007. So, I mean, the world, we're just, the crisis is not over. So I feel like it still needs to be addressed. That's why I still am addressing it. But yeah.
Ooh. Jeff, how about you? How was your, when was your sort of walking in the woods, walking in the tundra with scientists, or picking up your luggage? What was your moment where you go, oh my gosh, our planet is changing. This is something real.
I've been thinking about that during Zarya's answer, and I kind of feel like in a lot of ways it's just almost been in the ether almost my whole life, or at least since I've been politically aware, since my early 20s or so. And I would say that it's almost impossible to ignore if you live in California. It just like the wildfires are kind of assaulting you with smoke every year, or literally with flames. And it just became a thing that I felt was pretty overwhelmingly unignorable. And so, I've always been I binge on, I'm sure Attenborough played a role. I very much binge on documentaries all the time, whether they're art documentaries or science documentaries or whatever, so I'm like constantly watching things like that. And if you're watching those documentaries, even if they're just straight, very kind of by the numbers, even like BBC and National Geographic documentaries, which I kind of said that in a way, like those are some of the best ones, right? But they if you've been watching them since the 80s, it's pretty clear that the planet's been changing, right? So like I'll even go back and watch some of the old ones, like I think the OG, Cosmos is still the best one with Sagan, so for me, it's always kind of like I don't know that there's like a light bulb moment. It's already, it was always like it feels like the background fabric of most of my adult life.
Fascinating. How about Caroline? How about you? Did you have a moment, or was it something you just grew up as the fabric, as it was with Jeff?
So yeah, that's really interesting. And I was thinking about it too, that it was kind of a growing up thing, but I don't think I was really aware that it was climate change until later, say in high school, where in like my childhood, I grew up on Long Island, New York, and we used to get these massive snowstorms in the wintertime, and the snow would pile up against the door of the sliding back door of my parents' house, and you'd have to open the sliding door and carefully like step over that snow wall that has accumulated in order to like not knock all that foot of snow into the house. But then I realized in high school, like those snow walls that you usually would get like don't appear anymore, and it would maybe be like 3 inches of snow. And that's maybe one of the biggest observations, like anecdotally, that I realized that climate was changing. And then later working on, like, I was working at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, actually, where a lot of Zarya's colleagues on the Ice Bridge mission are. And I got to work with a lot of landslide data before I started working on fires. And I think just seeing the amount of landslides that are happening because of changes to rainfall changes to like hurricanes and those kind of phenomenon made me really aware that the planet was changing. And then seeing it again, like because it was at NASA, there is like satellite data, and seeing it from space, being able to see like after a huge hurricane goes through, for example, Hurricane Maria in like Puerto Rico, you could just see all these landslides against all these mountains just all next to each other, and probably on the ground devastating people's homes and people's like properties. So that was those are kind of my two climate change memories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Yeah, go for it.
Just wanted to add one thing to my answer, because it wasn't just the scientists that really made me aware of what was happening. We were in Greenland. There are locals that live there, and it was conversations with them, Inuit and otherwise, that also really opened my awareness to the crisis, because it wasn't something that we were talking about in the United States at the time in 2007. It was not in the newspaper every day like it is now, thankfully. But in Greenland, it's they were having to deal with it on a daily basis, having to adapt on a daily basis. Many of them were subsistence hunters, and they need the ice in order to go out into the landscape and hunt. Many of them don't have boats and can't pay for gas, and so they have their dog sleds. And so yeah, that was also what really opened my eyes to it.
It's interesting, in each of your stories, it's about an individual. You started with the scientists, all right, but it also ended up being the conversation about where you're connected with the environment. That's kind of what Carolyn was saying. Yes, she has her satellite data geeky piece, but it actually, what she remembers is the decreasing snowbank. And with Jeff, it was kind of like this sense that you're embedded with the earth in the life you grew up with. And so you had a sense of it. So does it mean that arts, and not everybody's that way, right? Not everybody is an observer or connected. Not everybody grew up in a wheat farm or grew up like being able to travel the places you got to travel. So is that one of the things that's the goal of art here, is to actually, in science, we talk about trying to connect people with our data and numbers, right? And we love them. Carolyn had to end with her graph because we love graphs, right? But is art that sort of way that we can connect people with the environment in a way that sometimes we don't quite do so well in science? Because it's interesting that you both, you all three told stories that, and mine was too. Mine wasn't about the data. Mine was of this sort of emotional response. And so is that what art does? Is it sort of is a way to connect people with the environment? Particularly people who may not be growing up on a farm in Utah.
I think the answer is yes to that question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, psychology tells us that we take action and make decisions based on our emotions more than anything else. That's been scientifically proven. And it's also been scientifically proven that art has this special ability to tap into our emotions. It's probably something that most of you feel. You maybe have felt it when you enter a museum or a gallery, or stand in front of a beautiful painting or an interesting or inspiring painting. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It taps into our emotions, and I think from there we can find a deeper understanding of the world and move forward and take action based on those feelings. So that's what I personally try to do with my work, because I feel like art is my sharpest tool to inspire people with. And yeah, I really do think that it adds that. It's not that we don't need the data and the graphs. We absolutely 100% need those. And that's why it's it was such a wonderful gift for me personally to be able to work closely with NASA scientists and others, to use that data and their scientific understanding and try and relay that in another way that's possibly more accessible for some people, not others, but just it can be an easier way to digest and to understand for some of us. We all take in information in different ways. So that's what I try to do with my work.
Carolyn, Jeff, do you have some thoughts on, whether or not the art's a way to connect people with the environment, to the snowbank or the field, or maybe?
I think that my feeling is like, if you make art that is trying to be didactic first and art second, it's probably not going to be very good art. So I try to primarily connect with people's hearts and their curiosity and their awe first, before I worry about like, oh, I have to like, I'm not a preacher, right? Like, so I think that activists, like I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'll run this by you guys and see what you guys think. But I think the activists are sort of always or frequently employing an army of facts in battles that they seem to constantly lose. And this is because, facts don't move people, emotions do. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to learn as much as we can about how humans work. So maybe it's basic, but I think about things and I go like, all right, how do we change the world? And if you think about that on a super rudimentary level, it's, well, we change human behavior. Or like, maybe to be more specific, humans change their own behavior. And so I more and more am like spending at least as much time trying to understand how the science of the human works and the human mind, and like how all of this stuff works, alongside any kind of climate change facts or whatever else, because that's ultimately why I shifted my film from being like, hey, I got to show people what's happening, to let's process grief instead. Because yeah, people, like, if they're shamed or hectored or whatever, like they just shut down, because we experience shame as trauma pretty much. Like our rational part of our brain shuts off if Brene Brown is to be believed. And I think she, probably should be. So a lot of it is, I think, people starting to shift how they communicate and starting to put more emphasis on talking to people they disagree with. Because I think about where I grew up, which is a very conservative religious community. And I'm very liberal personally, but like, I think about that community, and then I think about the bubbles of conversation in Los Angeles, and they couldn't be further apart. And there's so much like, oh, those idiots over there, which I'm guilty of too. Like, I think we all get frustrated with other humans. I mean, we're all, basically screw ups. So like, I think that maybe we have to, there's a lot of different things out there to help us communicate about these things. Like Yale has a Center for Climate Communications. There's like, and they have 6 steps that's came from, what was it? It was an initiative to help with convincing people of LGBTQ rights. But they adapted it for sustainable, like talking to people about climate change who disagree. And so I think it's helpful to realize like only really 10% of America, according to these sources, denies all climate science. There's something like 80% of people know that climate change is real. And you'll note I didn't use the word belief because it's not a belief. And then it's something like close to 60% know that it is real and human caused. So I feel like we're in a decent place there. And now it's kind of like, all right, how do we shift over to like, what should we focus on? And to me, I'm like thinking a lot more about power structures and those kinds of things rather than individual actions, which most of the science that I'm seeing coming out right now says that it like sustainable living is important because it's a community thing and it gets people to talk about science or climate change and like connect with all of that. But even if we are the most like sustainable living habits whatsoever, it won't solve the problem. It's important, but there's huge power structures in play that it seems like we're going to need to focus on if we actually want to reverse climate change.
Right, and I think some of what you're touching on is that a question, but I want to hear from Carolyn about sort of two on this, and then we're going to come back to how do we move from what I call the almost climate porn fear to action, you know, and kind of the title here. How do we move from just being actors in the climate change to actually losing? And I liked Zaria's comment. Art happens to be the sharpest tool I have, but Caroline, what do you think about this, you know, this question of, you know, are we using, and you're somebody who lives right at that bridge. How do you think you act in that bridge as somebody who's trying to use art and science to affect action?
Yeah, and I want to kind of summarize and touch on both what Jeff and Zarya said about the emotional aspect of art. And having engaged with both of your arts, I think this bridge of most people know about climate change. Now, how do we get them to like actually act on it? Is a lot of it is done through this visual aspect, this tangible ability to like grasp the nature of climate change, or just grasp the nature of nature, right? Because with Zarya, your pastel drawings are so massive in scale that it's almost like if you just stand right next to your painting, then it's like you're right at the glacier and you're on that boat or in that plane looking at the glacier and being able to almost touch it. And then with Jeff's, the 5 stages of grief in your most recent film is so impactful in the sense that it's almost as if you're in the blazes and your house is burning down, or if your house is not burning down, then you're the firefighter and you're watching somebody's house burn down because of this increased amount of wildfire that's caused by, or you know, affected by this climate change. And I feel like art has this twofold thing where, because it's impacting humans on such a massive and like terrible scale, that on one side art is there to help people who are experiencing climate change reflect on their own lives and reflect with their own grief of how the earth is changing, as well as then on the other side, it's appreciating the beauty of nature that is being destroyed by climate change and how we need to act on fixing that. And so my perspective is basically just the importance of art. And I think that science is there to give the information to support this idea that the climate is changing, and then bridging that we need these beautiful visuals. We need this idea of like, you know, picture is worth 1,000 words in order to convey that action does need to be taken. And I think that then goes into, Robin, what you're talking about, which is how do we transfer this motivation from witnessing art and witnessing climate change into acting?
So here, well, since you're on, Carolyn, why don't you take it right from there? Because that really is my next question: is how do we sort of move from what Jeff was grappling with, this sort of fear piece, and how do you think, as sort of a young scientist, activist, artist, how do you think we move from there's the wow, the beauty, and I live in the wow and the beauty of science and landscape, and geeky data, you know, but how do we move to past scaring the bejesus out of people? I mean, I've stopped doing a lot of the demonstrations I used to do because I realized I was scaring people. It's like, okay, we're not going to scare little kids anymore. We're going to figure out another way to explain science without making them think I'm going to drown their houses. So what do you think, Carolyn? How do we move past fear to action? What would you suggest?
Well, it's a very big question for sure. And
just give us 1 or 2 ideas. You don't have to solve the whole thing, and then we'll get, you know, Zarya and Jeff to respond to your ideas.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, like the things that come to mind is that I think first of all is listening to the voices that are engaging with climate on an everyday basis. I think especially what Zarya touched on, and the people that Jeff has interacted with, also the indigenous voices who they've been dealing with climate like all their lives and all their past history. And I think something that is really interesting in California was that was that there's this like increasing practices of like backburning that indigenous people have been using for hundreds of years, but then have only been recently been starting to get introduced back into fire management in California. And one thing is like, on a collective scale, how do we get that action back? Like, how do we get these practices that have been able to sustain forests in the Western United States back into our current government practices, our current government structures? And then based off of that idea, then what Jeff was getting to is this idea of like tackling the power structure. And I think that I'm really actually excited that people like my age and people younger than me are getting so politically active right now. But I think a lot of engaging with your local politics, engaging with like on the city level and on the county level, and then on the government level is super important, whether that's calling your politicians and making sure that they know about climate change and that they make sure it's on their agenda, or protesting, or all these other forms of engaging. And even as a scientist, I know there's a few scientists in the audience, is having that scientific voice at the White House, for example, like through professional organizations or through local like extracurricular clubs and colleges.
Great. Zarya, Jeff, you want to sort of follow on to that? How do we move from fear to action?
Zarya, do you want to go first?
Sure. I'll just rewind for a second and just to touch upon something that you said, Robin. I think, well, first of all, there are so many answers to the question. And we definitely don't have time in the next 15 minutes of this panel talk to go over all of them, because it's just, there are a myriad of ways that we can all take action, that we can all do our best to make this world a better place, right? And like I said, art is my sharpest tool. I think it's a matter of like figuring out what your sharpest tool is. Like, what are you most passionate about, first of all? Because the best action and the best what's the word, the best things that you make, I'm not finding the right words, but for me, that's art, that's making images, that's the thing I feel like I'm best at, and I'm most passionate about the landscape, and so I'm making work about landscape, and that's where you have the best, where you can move people the most, when it's really coming from the heart and coming from you, and there's that passion behind it. That's what really, I think, shines through the work that you do, and then onto the people that are experiencing it and can move them the most. And so sometimes sometimes people need to be afraid, they need to be shocked, and they need to see those images of wildfires and chunks of glaciers crashing into the ocean, and we need to hear about how there are millions of climate refugees, and some people need to be shocked into action that way. Others, like me personally, operate from more of a positive place, because I end up sort of feeling overwhelmed when I'm afraid of all the destruction that's happening, and it just feels like too big of a problem for me to solve. And so personally, I operate more from a positive place, and that's why I try to show the beauty of these places that we stand to lose. And yeah,
maybe
so
you
I think
actually
it's just
should think about beauty of these places we must preserve, as opposed to lose. Again, if you're thinking about how to turn it,
right. Thank you. Yes, that is absolutely right. It's about positive language too. I need to change that and say that instead.
No, just thinking about how, if you want to think about saying that, this is the part of the planet, this is places I've had the honor to go and you've had the honor to go that are unique. And when Carolyn stands on the moon and looks back, she's going to want to see them, right?
Absolutely.
Jeff, do you have?
I've got some action plans.
Zarya. Anyway,
sorry.
Zarya.
Zarya?
What?
I interrupted you. I realized.
I'm sorry. That's fine. No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Then go ahead. I just didn't want to be some of you done, Zarya.
No worries.
I've got some, if people want to like pull out a pen and a paper, I've got some like action plan stuff for you right now. If you want to like listen to some podcasts and read some books. So there's a book called All We Can Save, which is, it's an anthology of climate solutions as presented by women. And some of them are Indigenous women, some of them are trans women, some of them are names you know, some of them are names you don't know. It's, I feel like, a huge breath of fresh air, and very, very hopeful, actually. And then one of the people who was in charge of compiling that anthology co-hosts a podcast called How to Save a Planet. And in one of those episodes, there's an episode called Trying to Talk to Family About Climate Change. It's got 6 different steps of how, like, what you can go through, like, and how to do it, and how to essentially listen first and assert your opinion later in that conversation, and like not be reactive. It's really good. There's another episode, a more recent one, that's called Is Your Carbon Footprint BS? And it makes the best case for pro and con. And there's like very good things to hear on both sides of that. And at the end of that episode, they outline 3 steps. And these 3 steps are very much reflected in what Zarya and Caroline and Robin have already said here. And so you do a Venn diagram where you write out, all right, what are you good at? You know, you don't want to, like, you know, you got to do something you're good at. What is the work that needs doing, and what brings you joy? So like in Zarya and I, in my case, like, you know, we make art. That's what we love. The same thing with Caroline, right? And the science as well. And so those are the things that help quite a lot. And if you are living in a way that brings you joy, that is infectious. Even if you're making a piece that's maybe a little more scary or whatever it is, that passion can carry through. When it comes to art, like say California on Fire, for me, is definitely not at all about fear, although it will scare in moments because it's a film, right? There's a lot of emotional dynamics to it. But it's a lot more about getting through to an emotional, like breaking through the din and roar of humanity, as I call it, and reaching somebody's heart or reaching their mind. And then, of course, like there's all these things that fit together and play a role. So like, I think, you know, those things combined with, especially Brene Brown's, if you like listen to her lecture series, The Power of Vulnerability, which is not directly about climate change, obviously, but I think that that kind of work and that kind of stuff will help us talk to each other and to people we disagree with. And it'll help make that Grand Canyon between like the rural people in Utah I grew up with and my super hip Los Angeles friends a little bit closer together, because we actually have quite a lot more in common than we think we do because of the news media and TV. And like news media, all of it is designed to drive outrage so that you look at ads. It's just, that's the only reason for its existence for the most part. And so I think that we need to find common ground. Politicians are never going to help us do that. The TV will never help us do that. As Americans, we need to decide to do it.
And isn't that sort of one of the things you're trying to use art to, is bring us together into those shared experiences? And so that we can, you know, have things that aren't either red or blue or fake news or not news. So I have one more question for you guys, and then we will see if there's anything we want in the questions from the audience. You know, why each one of you has looked at the planet in a really special way. You know, Caroline dreams of going to the moon and looking back. I wanted to be the CEO of a big space company myself.
Me too.
Yeah, Zarya is gonna, you know, has had this opportunity to go on ships and planes, and you've trained yourself so you could do 70 wildfires. So why is it that, how is it that, where is it the next place you'd want to take somebody if you could dream in your art? I know I was just going to ask you about where you'd already been, but I decided that was boring. So now I'm going to change it on you and say, where would you like to be able to take people next? And maybe, you know, maybe I'll start with Caroline, because I bet she knows.
Yeah, I think Robin already knows, is you know, I'd like to take people to space, and you know, I think with a lot of commercial aerospace companies, it's going to happen very soon. I don't know if we're all going to be rich enough to do it yet, but that will be the place, because I think maybe you've all heard of the overview effect, which is when astronauts have gone out into space and they've looked down on Earth, they see this concept of like no borders, where we're all, I think what Zarya termed just earlier, global citizens, and being able to approach climate and both the science and the art and the motivation of taking action from a non-bipartisan, like just forget any political affiliation. Like we're all just trying to we're trying to live on this planet and we need to take better care of it. And I think that's the bottom line. Also, there's larger structures that are stopping us from our individual actions, but then if we're able to combat these larger structures, then I think it would be great. And I think that seeing it from space would help with that.
Cool. So we're all going to do space travel. Sorry, Jeff, who has come up with an answer next?
I am so, I just want to go with Carolyn, you know.
Oh, you're okay. You're going to go to space too with Carolyn. Okay.
I'm so on board with the space thing. Like, take me to space. Let's go. I want to take people into the heart of time, stopping in a black hole itself, you know, but that's what I'm always trying to do, is take people into these deep fractured paradoxes that seem to comprise the universe. I'm fascinated by unreachable knowledge, you know, like, so, you know, where do we want, I mean, like, I like how limitless that is, but I'm constantly trying, like, all of my work goes on a spectrum of creation and destruction. And so, you know, California on Fire veers pretty far into destruction. Other works I have veer pretty creation. And I think that might be like the apocalyptic upbringing of a very religious childhood or something like that. The end is near, you know. And so, you know, I'm just sort of like wanting to explore the awe of existence in a lot of ways with what time I have left on the planet. And I'm always seeking to do that, even in the middle of destruction when I go into that.
Cool. Zarya, he's going to go to space and destruct things. What are you going to do?
Hey, that's not a
I'll go to space with you. No, I did. My interest in going to the moon was definitely recently, or like in the last year, peaked with this first passenger trip to the moon that some of you in the audience may have heard of through SpaceX. So I would love to do that. But I have before that happens, I have a long list of places on this planet where I would love to visit and to capture with my work. A bunch of low-lying island nations that I would still really like to go to. Tuvalu is one at the top of the list. A lot of places in South Pacific. And then there are many more glaciers that need to be documented. So I would really love to like, so I got to walk on a glacier for the very first time on one of my more recent polar trips, and it was an incredible experience, and it was only like, 3 hours. And so I would really love to do more of that. I want to maybe even camp on a glacier. I don't know if that's possible, but just spend a couple of weeks and really get to traverse its surface and learn its cracks and crevices, at least in a small radius, and kind of just get intimate with a glacier.
Yeah, first time I dragged my kids to a glacier. It's like, we have to go to a glacier. But my favorite moment of ice sheets is when we were on top of the East Antarctic ice sheet. It's so quiet there that when you walk away from the camp and you realize you're standing on top of a mountain range that hasn't been exposed to air for 35 million years. It's just totally encased, and the water runs uphill there because crazy things happen underneath.
Oh, wow.
But then you lie down and you just listen, and what you can hear is nothing but the snow, the little crystals of snow bouncing across the top of the ice sheet. That's like my favorite moment of being, getting to know the ice sheet well. That's of all my favorite moments. That's just like lying at the end of in the blue sky, because you're about as close as you can to space in Antarctica, and you get less. I used to think pictures were crazy, but when you're that high up, the sky is really blue, an intense blue, particularly in Antarctica. Anyway, so that's where I would go. I would go back to the top of the ice sheet, and I'd take you, Zarya, and we could lie there and listen to the snow crystals bounce across the top
like
of
to
the
read
ice
both.
sheet.
Yeah,
I'd
I'd
like
love to
to
have a
come.
recording of that sound. That sounds like a great sound.
I don't know if
Yeah.
it was one of those places that was so hard to go that I didn't take any journalists or artists. It was very hard to get there. Anyway, why don't we just take one or two of these questions? There's an interesting one. What do you think? I was thinking there's one interesting one. What role should artists play in policy making? Art and artists it's a very long question. I just took the last piece, but
Unfortunately, artists can't make policy.
neither.
So what we can do is try to influence either people to ask their constituents to make the policy, or we can influence the politicians themselves with the work that we make.
I would like to take that question to say, yeah, we can't directly make policy, but I think that everyone should come up with a way to pitch conservatives. And my pitch for conservatives is, look, I know that a lot of you believe in, I did it. See, a lot of you know that climate change is real. And you need to start talking to each other, because liberals have no currency in your bubble. And you need to demand that your own politicians act on climate. And I don't know if that's a good pitch or not, but it's like one that I try to make. And I just think that that will help influence policy. We need to do things like redirect a lot of our efforts to getting people to vote, running for office, these kinds of activities that will bring about structural change.
Caroline, what do you
Voting
think?
is the answer there.
Oh.
Artists can vote to change policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have much else to add. I think
Okay.
I think the person-to-person connection is important here. Like talking to people who who like don't really listen to the climate change facts, climate change information, climate change motivation as much. And I think, everybody has family members, like talking to them. And I think the role of artists, I think artists should define their role, actually. I don't even want to say what artists should and shouldn't do. I think the possibilities are endless. And I think including more art and just science in general is also really, I think it's an untapped resource so far. And I think funding structures might be getting in the way right now, but there's a future path forward.
Oh, let's see. There's a question here about, do we have long records of data? And we don't. And I'm just going to answer that really quickly, because that's right in or it's actually in Carolyn's ballpark too. But I'll just say that we have really good records of what climate has been globally from the lab that Carolyn works with, from listening to the trees around the globe. And then we know an awful lot about the chemistry of the atmosphere and the temperatures from ice cores that go back hundreds of thousands of years. So we have way more data than 250 years. That's one of the beauties of science. And I think maybe we'll just start. There's one more question: what you have done individually to address climate, in your lifestyle. Are you guys willing to answer that?
I can start, but I think the biggest thing I do is devoting my work to climate change with my art. But beyond that, a bunch of little things like riding my bike as much as I can, and recycling and carbon offsetting, and flying as when it's only really necessary. I know that's hard for me to say because it's like, do I need to go visit another glacier? No, I probably have enough pictures of one that, but yeah, there's a lot of little things. Sorry, they're not coming off the top of my head, but
that's okay.
yeah, I think the biggest thing is just like focusing my everyday work, my vocation on this topic and doing the best that I can with that. I think that's probably has more influence than anything else that I do in my day-to-day life.
Interesting. I know with scientists, if you take individual action, you are more credible. I have no idea if that applies for artists too. Jeff, what do you obviously Jeff has spent a lot of time reading and teaching himself about this. Have you, in response to this question, let's see, this is, what lifestyle change have you done for the sake of climate?
I've done a lot of them, but I really feel like this is the kind of question that we should start turning away from. I think it mostly results in people feeling bad about what they're not doing, myself included. And I don't know that that's productive when 90+% of the problem is a structural kind And right, so I have done these things in the past, like I have definitely like tried to out green people or like, kind of really pushed and I'm not so sure that it's constructive. And so that's all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to be pragmatic and think about what is actually going to work. And so like, I would say that where I'm coming to now is I would be more inclined to ask someone who, is on the fence or doesn't believe in climate change or something like that. I would be more inclined to ask them about what their fears are and listen to them than to say like, hey, I bought like this kind of car, or I'm like doing this, you know what I mean? Like, I just feel like there's those in like that sustainable living, I think is important because it empowers us as individuals and it helps to like have a tribal thing where we influence our neighbors and they influence us and we get in the habit of thinking about the planet. So I think that it's important, but I think that like I'm shifting quite a lot about how I'm thinking about that approach in like my personal life and actions, if any of that makes sense.
Right. I think I've got it. Carolyn, how about you? Have you made any lifestyle changes?
So I think personally, I like in terms of like trying to grapple with this larger industry, I'm trying to like limit my meat consumption a little bit more to, although like I know like agriculture is also very politically driven. And so meat is generally something that we need to also talk to our politicians about, obviously not eliminating it, but thinking about our carbon emissions. But then like, yeah, I think engaging in citizen science is something that I like doing too. So citizen science being the ability for anyone in the public to collect data or make observations that benefit some scientific research project. And NASA has a lot. So engaging with like taking pictures of clouds, or I worked on adding landslides to a global database to help with their hydrological landslide models. So that has been a super big positive for my individual action.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I'm sitting here a little off the grid cabin. So clearly my family's decided that, taking those individual actions are really important, Jeff. Actually my husband wrote a book, How to Live Sustainably Now, so we spend a lot of time. And I think I have this, and it's partially based again on the research that shows that if I'm going to be taken seriously as a climate scientist, that I have to show that I'm taking the problem seriously. So my approach is an individual to do a carbon footprint budget and see where I'm spending my carbon and see how I can drop that down. What can I do? But then at the same time, doing what you guys are all doing, looking at what tools I have to affect both change at the institutional, the governmental level, just trying to see what the sharpest tools I have, to use Zarya's term. Anyway, I think
and I want to talk about carbon footprint for just a second, because I agree with that, but carbon footprint was popularized by British Petroleum in the 70s. They've done these ad campaigns to blame shift onto consumers in lots of cases, power structures which we cannot affect on an individual level. We can affect a certain percentage. And so like, that's what I'm trying to be careful about, is that there's a lot of sneaky actions by these, corporations to try and shift the blame away from the power structures that really need to be changed. And there's a whole history of that. And it's actually pretty easy to look up. And there's articles that will trace the history of how corporations have blame shifted onto consumers as a distraction.
Right. It's also been remember this is much of the same conversation that went on during abolition, whether or not you should eat goods that were made by whose fault it was. But anyway, I think we can agree that we need action at many levels, and we need to address the power structures, as well as we're going to have to take individual actions. But
I'm not against that. I'm just saying that the power structures is 95% of the problem. So that's where I want to put 95% of my effort.
Yep. Well, we clearly, the four of us, could talk about this for a long time without even the prompts from the attendees. But thank you so much for coming. This has really been fun. Clearly, I could talk with you guys forever and argue and discuss and trying to figure out what we do with art and science and how we make the planet a better place. So I think I'll turn it over to Eden, who thank you very much for bringing us together. It was really fun.
Thanks, Robin.
This is great. So fantastic. Thank you, Robin, Caroline, Jeff, and Zarya, for such a fruitful and dynamic conversation. Thank you to all of our attendees for joining us. And check back our website for other upcoming panel discussions and for information on how you can visit Mana Contemporary to see Implied Scale, the exhibition that both Jeff and Zarya are participating in. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.